The dust of redemption, Nevada, tastes like shame. It settles on her tongue, a gritty film coating the inside of a mouth too dry to spit. Eliza Mayhew stands on the raw timber platform, a spectacle for the second time in a single day. The sun is a hammer, beating down on her worn calico dress and the fiery embarrassment burning on her cheeks. She is a piece of unwanted luggage, a parcel returned to sender. Only the sender is 1,000 miles and a lifetime away. This morning, she was a mail-order bride, filled with the brittle hope of a dry leaf. She'd stepped off the train and into the gaze of Silas Croft, the man whose letters had promised a new life. He was a small man with a pinched face and eyes that measured her worth in acres and livestock. He'd taken one look at her plain face, her work-roughened hands, her frame that was sturdy rather than fashionably frail, and his lip had curled. He had rejected her on the spot, right there on the station platform, as if she were a bolt of inferior cloth. That was the first humiliation. The second is happening now. Croft, furious at having wasted the train fare, has decided to recoup his losses. He's put her up for auction. Not a wife auction, nothing so formalized. This is cruder. He is auctioning her labor, her indenture, to the highest bidder. The first man to claim her, a leering saloon owner with breath like sour mash, was outbid by a rancher who thought she might be strong enough for mucking stalls. It's a grotesque spectacle, and Eliza has retreated deep inside herself, to a small, cold place where the auctioneer's booming voice is just a distant drone. She focuses on a single, motionless figure at the edge of the sparse crowd. He is different. He stands apart, leaning against a support post of the general store's porch, his stillness a stark contrast to the jeering and bidding of the townsfolk. He wears buckskin trousers and a simple linen shirt, his long, dark hair tied back with a leather cord. His face is all angles and shadows, his skin the color of rich earth, and his eyes are what hold her. They are dark and observant, missing nothing, yet revealing nothing. They don't assess her like a mare, nor do they pity her. They simply watch, and in their depths, she sees a reflection of her own isolation. He is Navajo. She guesses from his features and the quiet authority he wears like a second skin. A scout, perhaps. An outsider, most certainly. The bidding stalls. $1.50. The price of a decent shovel. A wave of dizziness washes over Eliza. This is it. This is the end of her world. The rancher who bid last smirks, confident in his purchase. But then, the figure by the porch pushes himself upright. He doesn't shout a bid. He moves. He walks through the crowd, which parts for him with a mixture of fear and disdain. He stops directly in front of the platform, his gaze lifting to meet Eliza's. And then he speaks, his voice low and steady, yet carrying with absolute clarity over the sudden silence. This is not how it is done. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The auctioneer, a portly man named Blevins, puffs out his chest. This is a private matter, friend. A settlement of a debt. The scout's eyes, black as obsidian chips, shift from Eliza to Silas Croft. She is not property. You cannot sell a debt attached to a person. A low murmur ripples through the crowd. This is a disruption they hadn't anticipated. Croft, emboldened by the men around him, steps forward. She owes me for her passage. I paid for a bride. Not this. He gestures dismissively at Eliza, the insult a fresh slap. The scout doesn't flinch. What is the amount? He asks, his tone flat. Croft, taken aback, stammers. $22. The scout reaches into a worn leather pouch at his belt. He doesn't count out coins. Instead, he withdraws a small, intricately beaded pouch and a folded piece of paper. He hands the paper to the sheriff, a man who had been watching the proceedings with bored indifference, but is now paying rapt attention. My pay voucher from Fort McDermott. It's good for $50. Give this man his 22. Then he turns his head, his gaze locking once more with Eliza's. He has not bought her. He has settled the debt. He has erased the premise of the auction itself. He has, in a single quiet act, changed the rules. And with his next words, his voice so low only she and the men closest can hear, the ground shifts beneath her feet, and the world tilts on a new axis. I will marry her. The silence that followed his declaration was absolute. It was a dense, heavy thing, broken only by the creak of a saloon door down the street and the nervous shuffle of Silas Croft's feet in the dust. The scout had not asked. He had stated. He'd made a claim that was more powerful than any bid because it wasn't about ownership. It was about an institution. Marriage. Even on the frontier, that word held a weight that a simple transaction of coin did not. The sheriff, a man named Miller whose authority was directly proportional to the path of least resistance, unfolded the pay voucher. He squinted at it, his lips moving as he read the official script. He looked from the paper to the scout, then to the sputtering Silas Croft. The paper's good, Silas. You'll get your money. He then turned to the scout, a flicker of something, begrudging respect, perhaps, or just confusion, in his eyes. You, Cale? The scout gave a short, affirmative nod. I am. Navajo scout, Cale, Miller said, more to the crowd than to the man himself. It was both an identification and an explanation, a label that placed Cale firmly on the outside of their world, even as he engaged with its most fundamental rules. To the people of Redemption, he was a tool, a phantom who moved through the territory tracking renegades or guiding patrols, useful but untrustworthy. An Indian who worked for the army was a man of two worlds, and therefore of none. Cale ignored the weight of their stares. His focus remained on Eliza. He saw the tremor in her hands, the way she clutched the thin fabric of her skirt. He saw the stark terror in her eyes, warring with a sliver of disbelief. He had offered her a different cage, perhaps, but one with a lock she hadn't expected. He took a single step closer to the platform. Come down, he said. It was not a command, but a quiet invitation. For a long moment, she couldn't move. Her mind reeled, trying to process the whiplash of the day. Rejected, sold, and now claimed. She looked from Cale's steady, unreadable face to the hostile glare of Silas Croft and the greedy eyes of the other bidders. She had no allies here. She had no home, no money, no future. This silent, strange man was offering an escape from the auction block. But to what? The unknown was a gaping maw, but the known was this public stripping of her humanity. She made a choice. Slowly, her legs trembling, Eliza Mayhew descended the rough-hewn steps. When her foot touched the dusty ground, Cale was there. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a shield, a solid wall between her and the gawking town. The preacher, Cale said to the sheriff, his voice leaving no room for argument. Sheriff Miller sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. This was getting more complicated than he liked. Cale, are you sure about this? It's irregular. The law is satisfied, Cale stated. The debt is paid. The rest is our business. He then did something that stunned the crowd into a fresh silence. He turned his head slightly toward Eliza, his voice dropping so low it was a vibration more than a sound. Is this your wish? He was giving her agency. After a day of being treated as an object, he was asking for her consent. The question was a lifeline. Her throat was tight with unshed tears, but she found her voice, a reedy, thin sound that was hers alone. Yes. The walk to the preacher's small clapboard house was the longest of Eliza's life. Cale walked beside her, not touching, but close enough that she felt the warmth radiating from him. The townspeople fell back, their whispers following them like a swarm of angry bees. Savage Taquine Croft's leavings. What's he want with a plain thing like her? She'll be dead or gone in a month. The words were pebbles thrown at her back, but for the first time, they didn't penetrate the fragile shell she'd built around herself. Cale's silent presence absorbed them. The ceremony was a blur. Preacher Davis was a nervous man, his hands fluttering as he read the rites. The words felt hollow, a formal script laid over a raw and desperate reality. When he pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss, no celebratory cheer. There was only the scratch of a pen as Cale signed his name and Eliza made her mark, her hand shaking so badly he had to steady it with his own. His touch was brief, firm, and surprisingly warm. It was the first time they had made physical contact. Outside, the world had not changed. The sun was still harsh, the town still hostile. Cale's horse, a sturdy Mustang with an intelligent eye, stood hitched where he had left it. Tucked behind it was a smaller, more skittish-looking mule laden with supplies. He untied the horse's reins. "We go now," he said, his first direct words to her as his wife. The journey was as silent as the ceremony. He helped her onto the mule, his hands impersonal and efficient at her waist, and then swung himself onto his horse with fluid grace. He led them out of redemption, not looking back. Eliza risked a single glance over her shoulder. Silas Croft was standing on the porch of the mercantile, his arms crossed, his face a mask of pure, vindictive fury. The sight sent a chill down her spine, but then Cale's broad back blocked the view, and they were heading out into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the high desert. His homestead was a half-day's ride from the town, nestled in a small, defensible canyon carved by a seasonal creek. It was not a ranch, not a farm. It was a refuge. A small, sturdy cabin made of stone and timber stood against the canyon wall, a testament to solitary, patient labor. A corral held no cattle, only Cale's Mustang. A small patch of earth near the creek bed had been tilled, showing the faint green of new shoots. It was a place of profound solitude, a landscape that echoed the man who lived within it. Cale dismounted and, without a word, helped her down. Her legs were stiff, her body aching from the tension of the day. He led the animals to the corral, leaving her standing alone in the yard, a stranger in a strange land, married to a man she did not know. The cabin door was a dark, uninviting rectangle. She looked at the vast, empty sky, the red rock walls of the canyon, the utter silence of the place. She had escaped the auction block, but she felt a new kind of fear creep into her heart. She was the property of one man now, a man whose mind was as close to her as this stony canyon. She wrapped her arms around herself, the desert wind picking up as the sun began to dip, feeling more alone than she had ever been in her life. Cale returned from tending to the animals. He stopped a few feet from her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. He gestured toward the cabin. "You're home." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Eliza looked at the dark doorway, then back at him. She saw no warmth in his eyes, no welcome. She saw only a quiet, deep-seated weariness, the look of a man long accustomed to being on his own. She had been bought, in a way, just with a different currency. Not with coin, but with a strange, unyielding code of honor that she could not begin to comprehend. She was his wife in name, but in truth, she was just another part of his solitude. The first days were a careful, silent dance of two strangers navigating a space far too small for their respective histories. Cale was a creature of routine and quiet efficiency. He rose before the sun, his movements economical and precise. He would check the snares he'd set along the creek bed, tend to his horse, and work on the small leather goods, moccasins, pouches, bridle repairs, that Eliza guessed he traded for supplies. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and functional. "There is water in the barrel. The fire needs wood. Do not wander beyond the canyon mouth." Eliza, in turn, sought refuge in work. The cabin, though clean, was starkly masculine, a place for sleeping and sheltering from the elements, not for living. She swept the packed earth floor until it was smooth and hard. She unpacked her meager belongings, a change of clothes, a Bible, a small pouch of needles and thread, and arranged them in a corner that she silently claimed as her own. She found a stash of flour, beans, and dried meat, and began to impose an order on the meager larder. Cooking became her domain, a silent offering she would leave on the rough-hewn table. He would eat without comment, but she noticed he always finished every last bite. The sleeping arrangements were the most telling sign of the chasm between them. The cabin had one room, dominated by a single cot built into the wall. On their first night, without discussion, he had taken a blanket and walked out the door, leaving her to the relative comfort of the cot. She lay awake for hours, listening to the alien sounds of the desert night, acutely aware of him sleeping just outside, a guardian at the gate of her new life. He never tried to enter her space, either in the cabin at night or in her thoughts during the day. He gave her a respect she had never known, yet it was the respect one gives a fragile, wild thing one does not wish to frighten away, not the intimacy of a husband for a wife. One afternoon, desperate for something green, something alive, she ventured to the small garden plot. It was a sad, struggling patch of earth. The corn was spindly, the beans plagued by some kind of blight. She recognized it instantly from her childhood on a poor farm in Ohio. She knelt, her fingers testing the dry, compacted soil. He had the will to plant, but not the knowledge. Her father, for all his faults, had been a farmer, and some of his wisdom had seeped into her through years of reluctant labor. She spent the afternoon there, using a sharpened stick to carefully break up the soil around the plants, her hands remembering the rhythm of the work. She found a patch of wild mint growing near the creek and transplanted it to the edge of the garden, knowing its strong scent would help deter pests. When Kale returned from a long patrol of the canyon rim, he found her there, her dress smudged with dirt, her face flushed with effort. He stopped at the edge of the plot, his shadow falling over her. She looked up, startled, half expecting a reprimand for touching his things. He said nothing, simply stared at the work she had done. He looked at the loosened soil, the carefully weeded rows, the small sprig of mint. His gaze was intense, analytical. He knelt down, not near her, but near a stalk of corn she had tended. He touched a leaf, his fingers gentle. "The ground is hard," he said, his first voluntary observation about their shared world. "It needs to be broken up," she replied, her voice a little breathless. "And it needs more water than it's getting." He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the entire plot. He looked at the creek, then back at the garden. "I will dig a channel." It was a conversation of no more than 20 words, but it was a beginning. It was the first time they had collaborated on something, the first time she had offered a piece of her knowledge and had it accepted not with praise, but with immediate, practical action. The next morning, he began digging a narrow irrigation ditch from the creek to the garden, his powerful shoulders moving with an easy, tireless rhythm. Eliza watched him from the cabin doorway, a strange feeling fluttering in her chest. It was not gratitude, not precisely. It was a sense of partnership, faint and fragile, but undeniably there. Their fragile peace was tested a week later. Their supplies were running low, and a trip to redemption was unavoidable. The thought of returning to that town, to those faces, filled Eliza with a cold dread. She watched Cale load the mule with the leather goods he'd finished. "I will go alone," he said, not looking at her. "No," she said, the word out before she could stop it. He turned, his eyebrows raised in a silent question. I have a list," she stammered, feeling foolish. "Things we need. Things you wouldn't know to get." It was a flimsy excuse, but the truth was more complicated. She was terrified of going, but she was more terrified of being left behind, of him facing the town's scorn on her behalf, without her there to what? She didn't know. To bear it with him. A long moment passed. He studied her face, his gaze lingering on the determined set of her jaw. "It will not be pleasant," he warned. "I am aware," she said, her voice stronger now. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Be ready at sunrise." The ride into redemption was tense. The silence between them was not the comfortable quiet of the canyon, but the taut silence of impending battle. As they reached the outskirts of town, Eliza instinctively pulled her bonnet lower, trying to shrink into herself. But Cale rode with his back straight, his head high, a silent challenge to anyone who dared to look their way. And they did look. The moment they entered the main street, a hush fell. Windows suddenly needed cleaning. Porches needed sweeping. Every activity became an excuse to stop and stare. The whispers started again, louder this time, more confident. Eliza felt their eyes on her like physical blows. She kept her gaze fixed on the space between her mule's ears, her knuckles white where she gripped the reins. Their first stop was the mercantile. The owner, a man named Henderson, had a face that could sour milk. He watched them enter, his eyes flicking from Cale's formidable presence to Eliza's downward face. Cale placed his finished leatherwork on the counter. "For credit," he said. Henderson inspected the pieces with a disdainful air, though Eliza could see the quality of the stitching was impeccable. "Not much call for this sort of thing these days," he grumbled, though he took it all the same. Eliza handed him her list. As he gathered the items, flour, salt, lard, coffee, his eyes kept darting toward her. "Heard you set up house with the scout," he said, his voice oily with insinuation. Quite a step down for what Croft was offering. Before Eliza could even flinch, Cale's hand shot out and rested flat on the counter. It was not a threatening gesture, but it held an immense, coiled stillness. Henderson's mouth snapped shut. "The goods," Cale said, his voice dangerously soft. "Now," Henderson scurried to finish the order. As they were leaving, a familiar voice cut through the air. Well, look what the buzzards dragged in." Eliza froze. Silas Croft was standing on the boardwalk, flanked by two of his hired hands. His face was blotchy with anger, his small eyes gleaming with malice. He was looking directly at Eliza. "Enjoying your new master, little lady?" he sneered. "Or does he just have you sleeping in the dirt with the snakes?" Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to run, to disappear. But Cale stepped slightly in front of her, a subtle movement that put his body between her and Croft. He did not speak. He did not draw a weapon. He simply looked at Silas Croft, his face a granite mask of contempt. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Croft, used to bluster and threats, seemed to shrink under that unwavering, silent gaze. He was a yapping dog facing a wolf. "Just making conversation," Croft muttered, his bravado evaporating. He cast a nervous glance at his men, who looked equally unsettled. He had expected a confrontation, a fight he could win with numbers. He hadn't expected this utter dismissal. Cale held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned his back on Croft, a gesture of supreme contempt. He loaded the last of the supplies onto the mule. "Let's go," he said to Eliza. As they mounted, Croft found his voice again, shouting at their backs. "You think you're better than us, Scout? You're nothing but a government dog. And you," he spat, his voice venomous as he pointed at Eliza, "you're nothing but a squaw now, bought and paid for." Eliza flinched as if struck. The word, flung with such hate, pierced through her fragile composure. Her eyes burned with tears, but then she felt a hand on her arm. Cale had reached over from his horse, his grip firm and steadying. He didn't look at her, but kept his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, pulling her along with him, away from the poison of the town. His touch lingered for a second longer than necessary, a silent message of solidarity that spoke louder than any words of comfort could. They rode out of redemption, leaving the hatred behind them, but Eliza knew, with a chilling certainty, that it would follow. The shared ordeal in town had subtly altered the landscape between them. The silence on the ride back to the canyon was different. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the shared quiet of allies who had faced a common enemy. Eliza found herself stealing glances at Cale's profile, at the strong line of his jaw and the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. He had defended her, not with violence, but with an immense, unshakable presence. He had not fought for her honor in the way a gentleman might, with dueling pistols at dawn. He had simply stood as a shield, absorbing the ugliness of the world so it would not touch her. That evening, as she prepared their meal, a new comfort settled in the small cabin. The space felt less like a shelter and more like a sanctuary. When Cale came in from the corral, he didn't just take his plate and sit in his customary silence. He stopped and watched her for a moment as she stirred the pot of bean stew. "The garden," he said. "It looks better." Eliza looked up, surprised. It was the closest he had ever come to a compliment. "The soil is getting softer," she replied, her heart giving a little flutter. "The water helps." "You helped," he stated a simple fact. He sat at the table, and for the first time, he did not immediately begin to eat. He waited until she had served herself and sat down opposite him. They ate in their usual quiet, but the air was charged with a new awareness. She was no longer just an obligation he had taken on. She was a contributor, a partner in this small, isolated world they were building. As the weeks turned into a month, their life fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons. The irrigation ditch Cale had dug worked wonders. Under Eliza's patient care, the small garden began to thrive. The corn grew tall and green, the beans fattened in their pods, and squash vines crept across the tilled earth. It became her sanctuary within the sanctuary, a place where she could pour her energy and see a tangible result. It was a place of growth, and she felt herself growing with it. Cale, in turn, began to share pieces of his world with her. He never spoke of his past, of the family he might have lost, or the reasons he chose to walk the lonely path of a scout. His teachings were practical, passed on through action rather than words. He showed her how to read the clouds to predict a storm, how to identify the tracks of a coyote versus a wolf. He taught her which plants in the canyon were good for medicine, yarrow to stop bleeding, willow bark for fever, and which were poison. He was a man deeply connected to the land, and by teaching her, he was slowly, cautiously connecting her to it as well. One afternoon, he returned from a hunt with a young buck slung over his shoulder. As he began to skin and dress the animal with practiced skill, Eliza came out of the cabin with a bowl of water and a clean cloth. She knelt beside him and began to wipe the blood from his hands and arms. It was an intimate, domestic act, one she performed without thinking. He froze for a second, his hands still, surprised by the casual intimacy of the gesture. He watched her face, her expression one of simple, focused care. He didn't pull away. When she was finished, he resumed his work, but a new line had been crossed. The next day, he began work on a new project. He spent hours by the creek bed, selecting and splitting long, slender willow branches. He worked with a quiet intensity that Eliza had come to recognize. She watched from a distance, curious but unwilling to ask. Finally, after 2 days of work, he brought the finished object to the cabin. It was a chair, a simple, sturdy rocking chair, the willow woven expertly to form a comfortable seat and back. He placed it near the hearth, in the corner she had unofficially claimed. He looked at her, a hint of something unreadable in his dark eyes. "For the evenings," he said. Tears sprang to Eliza's eyes. She blinked them back fiercely, but one escaped and trailed down her cheek. It wasn't just a chair. It was a recognition of her presence, of her permanence. It was a gift, the first she had ever received from him. It was a piece of him, his skill, his time, his thought, made for her comfort. She couldn't speak. She simply walked over to the chair and touched the smooth wood of the rocker. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she gave him a true, unreserved smile. A flicker of something, surprise, warmth, something akin to a smile in return, passed across his own face before his customary stoicism settled back into place. That night, she sat in the rocking chair, a mending basket in her lap, while he worked on a piece of leather by the light of the fire. The quiet in the cabin was no longer empty. It was full. It was the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other without the need for constant chatter. She watched the firelight play over the sharp planes of his face, the concentration in his eyes. He was no longer a stranger, no longer just a rescuer. He was Cale, her husband, and a terrifying, exhilarating thought bloomed in her heart. She was beginning to fall in love with him. The feeling was so new, so fragile, that she guarded it fiercely. It made her vulnerable in a way she hadn't been even on the auction block. Then, she had only her life and dignity to lose. Now, she had a home. She had Cale. She had something precious she was terrified of losing. Her fear was not unfounded. The peace of the canyon was an illusion, a temporary reprieve from a world that had not forgotten them. The first sign of trouble came not from Silas Croft, but from the sky. The summer heat broke in a series of violent thunderstorms that turned the dry creek bed into a raging torrent. The floodwaters rose with alarming speed, swallowing the banks and creeping toward the garden. Cale and Eliza worked side by side in the driving rain, using shovels and their bare hands to build up a crude earthen dam to divert the worst of the water. They were soaked to the bone, mud splattered up to their chests, but they moved with a shared, desperate purpose. At one point, a surge of water broke through their makeshift barrier, and the current caught Eliza, pulling her off her feet. Before she could be swept away, Cale's arm shot out, his hand clamping around her wrist like a manacle of iron. He pulled her back to safety, holding her against his chest for a brief moment, the rain plastering her hair to his shirt. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice a low growl against the thunder. They fought the flood for hours, until the storm finally broke and the waters began to recede. Their dam had held just barely. The garden was a swamp, but the plants were not washed away. Exhausted, shivering, and covered in mud, they stumbled back to the cabin. Inside, the fire hissed as their wet clothes dripped onto the floor. Cale handed her a dry blanket. "Get warm," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. He turned to start stripping off his wet shirt, his back to her. She saw a network of old scars crisscrossing his shoulders and back, some thin and white, others puckered and angry-looking. The silent testament of a violent past. Her heart ached for him, for the pain he must have endured, the pain he never spoke of. He was her husband, yet he was still a mystery. But as she stood there, wrapped in a blanket in their shared home, saved from the flood by his strength, she knew that whatever his past held, his present was here, with her. The thought should have been comforting, but it was threaded with a new kind of fear. The flood had been a force of nature, but the true storm was man-made, and she had a terrible feeling it was still gathering on the horizon. A few days later, her premonition proved true. Cale was checking his snares downriver when he saw the tracks. 3 riders, heading directly for the canyon. He recognized the shod hoof of Crofts gelding immediately. They were not coming for a casual visit. He raced back to the cabin, his face grim. "They are coming," he said, the words stripped of all but their essential, dangerous meaning. Eliza's blood ran cold. She saw the look in his eyes, the same focused intensity she'd seen when he was hunting, but this time it was different. This time they were the prey. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Cale was already moving, his actions swift and purposeful. He checked his rifle, a government-issue Springfield. He took down a long-barreled pistol from a peg on the wall and handed it to her. The weight of it was terrifyingly solid in her hands. "You know how to use this?" he asked. She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "Point it. Pull the trigger," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Do not come out. Not for any reason. Bar the door." He was going to face them alone. The thought was unbearable. "No," she said, clutching the pistol. "I won't hide in here while you—" His hands came down on her shoulders, his grip firm. He forced her to look at him. For the first time, the mask of stoicism was gone. In his eyes, she saw a raw, fierce protectiveness that stole her breath. "Eliza, you will do as I say. I brought you to this place to be safe. I will not have them touch you." The sound of horses approaching echoed off the canyon walls. There was no more time for argument. He pushed her gently toward the cabin door. "Bar it," he commanded, and then he was gone, melting into the rocks and shadows at the canyon mouth like a ghost. Eliza stumbled inside, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She slid the heavy wooden bar across the door, plunging the cabin into semi-darkness. She was alone, with only the cold weight of the pistol for company, listening to the sound of approaching hoofbeats that signaled the end of their peace, and perhaps the end of everything. The cabin was a tomb of suffocating silence, broken only by the frantic beat of Eliza's own heart. She pressed her ear to the thick timber of the door, straining to hear anything over the blood roaring in her ears. The hoofbeats stopped. She heard the murmur of men's voices, rough and ugly, then Cale's, a low and steady counterpoint. She could not make out the words, only the tone, the taunting, goading pitch of Silas Croft, and Cale's unwavering, dangerous calm. She clutched the pistol, its coldness a stark contrast to her clammy hands. Cale's order had been absolute. Do not come out. He was trying to protect her, to keep the violence of his world from spilling into the sanctuary he had built for her. But she was no longer the frightened, helpless woman from the auction block. This cabin, this small patch of land, this life, it was hers as much as it was his. She would not cower inside it while he faced death for her. The shouting outside grew louder. A gunshot cracked through the air, sharp and final. Eliza's breath hitched in a sob. Was it Cale? Was he hurt? Was he dead? The thought was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Another shot followed, then another. The sounds of a scuffle, a grunt of pain, a vicious curse. Her mind, paralyzed by fear a moment before, was suddenly sharpened to a razor's edge by a surge of pure, cold rage. They would not take this from her. She moved away from the door and ran to the cabin's single small window, a shuttered opening on the sidewall that faced the creek. Pushing the heavy wooden shutter open a crack, she peered out. What she saw made her heart leap in her throat. Cale was using the rocks and scrub brush for cover, a phantom moving between positions. One of Croft's men lay on the ground, clutching his leg, his pistol several feet away in the dust. The other was pinned behind a large boulder, firing blindly toward Cale's last known position. And then she saw Croft. He wasn't engaged in the fight. He was sneaking, moving in a low crouch along the canyon wall, circling around to flank the rocks where Cale was concealed. He held his pistol ready, a snake slithering toward an unsuspecting victim. Cale was focused on the man behind the boulder. He didn't see Croft. He was walking into a trap. There was no time to think, no time to be afraid. Eliza lifted the heavy pistol with both hands, bracing her arms against the window frame. Her heart hammered, her vision swam. Point it. Pull the trigger. The memory of Cale's voice, calm and clear, cut through her panic. She took a deep, shuddering breath, lined up the barrel with Croft's advancing form, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space. The recoil slammed her shoulder back against the wall. Smoke filled the air, acrid and blinding. Through the haze, she saw Croft cry out and stumble, not falling, but dropping his pistol as he clutched at his arm. Her shot had been wild, but it had been enough. The distraction was all Cale needed. He burst from cover, not toward Croft, but toward the second gunman. He moved with a terrifying speed, closing the distance in a blur. He didn't fire his rifle. He used it as a club, a single brutal blow that knocked the man senseless. Silence descended upon the canyon, sudden and absolute. It was broken only by the groans of the two wounded men. Croft was staring at his bleeding arm in disbelief. Then his eyes found the cabin window. He saw Eliza, her face pale, the pistol still smoking in her hands. His expression shifted from shock to pure, unadulterated hatred. Cale followed his gaze. He saw Eliza at the window, saw what she had done. A complex emotion flickered in his eyes. Shock, fury that she had disobeyed him, and something else, something deeper. Respect. He turned his attention back to Croft, his face a granite mask. He walked toward him, picking up Croft's discarded pistol from the dust as he went. He stopped in front of the smaller man. Croft, cradling his wounded arm, shrank back. "I'll see you hang for this, Scout," he whimpered, his bravado gone, replaced by sniveling fear. Assaulting a white man and getting your squaw to do your dirty work. Cale's hand shot out, grabbing the front of Croft's shirt and hauling him to his feet. "She is my wife," he said, his voice a low, lethal whisper. Each word was a stone dropped into a deep well. "You came to my home. You threatened my family. There is no law in this territory that will protect you from that." He didn't hit him. He didn't kill him. He did something far more devastating. He shoved Croft back toward his horse, then looked at the other two men, one still unconscious, the other groaning and trying to sit up. "Get him," Cale ordered Croft. "Get them both, and get off my land." He stood over them, a silent, implacable judge, as Croft and the conscious man struggled to get their partner onto his horse. "You will not come back," Cale stated. It was not a threat. It was a pronouncement of fact, as undeniable as the rising of the sun. "If I see you, or any of your men, within a day's ride of this canyon, I will not wound you. I will put you in the ground. Do you understand?" Croft, his face ashen, could only nod mutely. He scrambled onto his own horse, and the three of them rode away, a defeated, pathetic procession, leaving their broken pride and spilled blood in the dust of the canyon floor. Cale watched until they were out of sight. He stood motionless for a long time, the rifle held loosely in his hand, the tension slowly bleeding out of his shoulders. The adrenaline rush subsided, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep weariness. He turned and walked back toward the cabin. Eliza had unbarred the door. She stood on the threshold, the heavy pistol hanging limply at her side. She was trembling, the aftermath of her terror and her terrible act finally crashing down on her. He stopped in front of her. His face was unreadable, carved from stone. He gently took the pistol from her hand and set it on the ground. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He saw the fear there, but also the fierce determination that had made her pull that trigger. He saw the woman who had tended his garden, who had sat in the chair he built, who had stood against the current of the flood with him. The woman who had just saved his life. His hands came up, not to her shoulders this time, but to her face. His calloused thumbs gently brushed away the tear tracks and powder smudges from her cheeks. His touch was incredibly tender. "I told you to stay inside," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You told me this was my home," she whispered back, her voice choked. "I will not hide while my home is under attack." A long, shuddering breath escaped him. It was the sound of a wall cracking, of a dam that had held for a lifetime finally giving way. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw everything in his eyes. The pain of his past, the loneliness of his existence, and a deep, overwhelming love that he had no words for. He didn't need words. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or demand, but of profound, desperate gratitude. It was a kiss that tasted of gunpowder and rain, of fear and relief, of two solitary souls finally, irrevocably, finding their way home to each other. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against him, his face buried in her hair. The sanctuary was no longer just the land or the cabin. It was the space between them. They stood there for a long time as the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in hues of gold and rose. Two survivors, two partners, a family forged in silence and baptized in fire. He held her, and in the shelter of his arms, Eliza knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would never be auctioned again. Her value had been proven, not by coin or contract, but by the steady, unwavering beat of her own brave heart. The aftermath of the violence was a heavy silence. They moved through the necessary tasks with a slow, deliberate grace, their shared trauma a palpable thing in the air. Cale disposed of the blood-stained rags and checked the perimeter of the canyon again, his movements still laced with a hunter's vigilance. Eliza, her hands finally steady, cleaned the pistol with a focus that bordered on reverence, the scent of oil and solvent a strangely comforting anchor in the swirl of her emotions. Later, as twilight bled into the canyon and filled it with soft, purple shadows, they sat at the table. The meal was simple, cold biscuits and dried meat, for neither of them had the heart for cooking. The rocking chair Cale had built for her sat empty by the hearth, a silent witness to the day's events. Cale finally broke the quiet. He was looking at his hands, which lay flat on the table. "In my first life," he began, his voice low and raspy, as if unused to shaping such words, "before the Bluecoats, I had a family, a wife, a daughter." Eliza's breath caught. She waited, knowing this was a gift of immense trust, a door opening into a room he had kept locked for years. "Comancheros," he said, the word flat and dead. "They came at dawn. I was away hunting. When I returned, there was only smoke and silence." He fell quiet, the memory of vast, empty landscape in his eyes. "I tracked them for a month. I found them. After that, there was nothing. The world was ash. The army gave me a new name, a new purpose. Hunting men. It was the only thing I had left." He finally looked up, his gaze meeting hers across the table. "When I saw you on that platform, I saw a different kind of ghost. Someone the world was trying to turn to ash. I thought I could build a wall around you, keep you safe from the fire." He shook his head, a small, weary gesture. But the fire came anyway. And you met it with fire of your own. Eliza reached across the table and laid her hand over his. His skin was warm, his knuckles scarred. You didn't just build a wall, Cale, she said softly. You gave me a garden. You taught me the names of the stars. You built me a chair. You gave me a home. You can't keep the fire out of the world, but you don't have to face it alone. His fingers curled up, entwining with hers. His grip was strong, a silent acknowledgement of her words, of her presence, of everything. The formal arrangement, born of pity and honor on a dusty street, had been burned away, leaving something pure and unbreakable in its place. They sat like that for a long time, their hands clasped on the rough-hewn table, the silence no longer empty, but full of everything that had been found and everything that had been fought for. Outside, a coyote called from the rim of the canyon, its lonely cry echoing in the vast, starry emptiness of the desert night. But inside the small stone cabin, there was no loneliness. There was only the steady warmth of two hands clasped together, a quiet promise in the flickering lamplight. Cale looked at Eliza, at the woman who had been auctioned twice in one day, the woman who had saved his life, the woman who held his hand now as if she had been born to do it. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deeper than any grief, that his life had not ended in ash. It was just beginning. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them?